Good evening. My name is Dr. Betty Tonsing, and I'd like to welcome you to the 2022 Carl Gateweiler Great Decisions Program Series. This is an 8-program series that it is America's largest discussion program on foreign policy. It goes all across the United States in different formats. Some gather to read a magazine that is published called Great Decisions, and it comes with a DVD. There are 8 articles, just as we are an 8-program series, and some councils just gather to look at the video and to read the article and discuss. And several councils, such as we, have a speaker. Our preference is to have a speaker and find the best possible speaker we can to address that particular topic. And then what distinguishes us from just a regular seminar or a conference or a program you might attend is that we pride ourselves on having a very robust Q&A, because having your engagement is what makes this extremely important. It's important that we have a credible forum, and we're proud that we do. This is a reputation that all councils across the United States pride themselves on, but it's also important that you're engaged. We call it an engaged citizen. We're all diplomat citizens, citizen diplomats. We're ambassadors for our own country. We're ambassadors just around the world with each other and extending fellowship and peace and goodwill. But being informed is a good tool to have in being informed with each other and having those discussions. And having the Q&A is important. The Indiana Council of World Affairs has another major program series called Distinguished Speakers, and that meets with the program once a month starting in August through May. And then, of course, we have other programs, Academic World Quest, dining affairs. It's all a lot of fun, and we're glad that you're able to join us this evening. We'll be keen to tell you about more. Now, we meet for about 8 consecutive weeks, but we do not meet the weeks that there is the monthly program for distinguished speakers, because we feel like if you can join us just once a week for those 8 weeks, that's great, but we don't think you want to give us every night of your week. What have you already missed just in the last few months, for those of you who might be new and you just heard about this? You know, last week we just had that amazing program with the Ukrainian ambassador to the United States. We had several hundred people who attended. We ended our program year for 2021 with a very engaging program. This was again through distinguished speakers with 2 different panels on Afghanistan. But we did something different. We actually had young people that 2 of us had known as students when we were working with them, both in Afghanistan and in Kyrgyzstan and Central Asia, and they went back to Afghanistan to become a part of the future workings of their country, the future civil society, and working within the ministries of Afghanistan. And then they were part of now becoming a refugee when I taken over again by the Taliban. And these were young people, now young professionals, who had a lot to say to us in those 2 different evenings of panels. Now, you won't have to miss anything going forward if you can join us as a member of the Indiana Council of World Affairs. Once you become a member, then you're on our mailing list forever, and we're going to inform you about all these fantastic programs. So we really hope that you can join us. We need your support. We've been able to offer our Zoom programs since COVID. None of us could have predicted that COVID, we're now going into, I think, our 3rd program year with Zooming. None of us could have predicted this would last this long. And so we're able to keep our programs affordable, and nothing's more affordable than free, but we do have our program cost to bear. And we've been happy to offer these for free. When we go back live, which will happen, not this program year very likely, but certainly in the future, that we would like to have a hybrid. What we've learned about Zoom is that it's opened up a very exciting world for you. It allows our audiences to come from much farther than just Central Indiana, as well as our speakers. So please consider joining us. Please consider supporting us. This allows us to bring on the quality of speakers and programs that we have. And we're excited about this evening's program. We can never hear enough about the environment, about climate change. We simply cannot hear enough. What we'd like to be able to offer is a different approach. We're very excited about our speaker this evening. He's a young visionary professional, and Diane Farrell is going to introduce our speaker this evening.
Thank you, Betty. It's my pleasure to introduce Jesse Kharbanda. Jesse is the executive director of Hoosier Environmental Council, Indiana's largest environmental policy organization. Jesse has focused HEC's initiatives around environmental health and justice, land and water protection, and climate solutions. Jesse has been passionate about expanding the tent of people who care about the environment, and he has been personally involved in forging deeper connections with public health organizations, the business community, and faith-based groups, among other constituencies. Jesse's leadership honors include being named to the 40 Under 40 list by the Indianapolis Business Journal and receiving the Hulman Health Achievement Award for Public Policy Advocacy. Jesse has graduate degrees from Oxford University and undergraduate degrees from University of Chicago. Please join me in welcoming Jesse Kharbanda.
Thanks so much, Diane. And thank you, Betty, for heralding the start of this great decision series. It's an honor to be with all of you today, and I'm truly thrilled by the turnout, particularly knowing that this pandemic has lasted a long time, and Zoom fatigue is always a challenge. So really thrilled to see such a nice turnout, and looking forward to engaging with many of you during the Q&A. I'm going to go ahead and share my, my screen and dive into this all-important topic. All right. So the Hoosier Environmental Council is, as Diane mentioned, Indiana's largest environmental policy organization. And we have three aims. We work to advance environmental health and justice, land and water protection, and climate solutions. So fitting for the topic tonight. And the way that we do that is through education, technical assistance, and public policy advocacy. That last piece can manifest itself in influencing at the congressional level or at the local government level, but it principally focuses on state government, executive, judicial, and most of all, legislative. I want to dedicate this program, or my remarks, to a dear friend of mine, a dear friend I'm sure of many people here, Dr. John Clark. John embodied the ethos of the type of organization that ICWA is, and did so much to bring so many different diverse groups together to build a greater sense of community in Indianapolis, and to make people a lot more sensitized to the suffering and to the beauty of the developing world. So we miss him and thank him for all that he's done for humanity. My talk is going to be called Near Time, well, it should have been Near Term Opportunities to Advance Climate Solutions in Indiana. And you might ask, well, Jesse, why discuss Indiana before an audience focused on international affairs? And the skeptic would say, well, the focus really ought to be at what's happening at the federal level. And Congress's most meaningful climate action in the current administration, the Infrastructure Act, passed very recently, very much does have a climate element to it, most notably in the form of a significant investment in passenger rail, mass transit, and electric vehicles. And there is continued talk about the passage of the Build Back Better plan, which would be the greatest investment in trying to address climate change, if it were to pass, in American history, most notably through passing an array of tax credit incentives for residential and businesses and industry to significantly decarbonize. Now, truly, the game-changing policy to address climate change would be the enactment of a carbon tax. And that would be an instrument by which we wouldn't have to pick any particular technology and put our bets on that particular technology, but be neutral and say we're going to impose a tax on a type of activity that hurts the public commons, that hurts the public good, namely carbon pollution or namely greenhouse gas pollution. This would be the ideal policy instrument to unleash the forces of capitalism to dramatically decarbonize America and eventually to decarbonize the world as countries adopt this policy. And as you can see in this chart here, there's a significant game-changing.
Jesse, your slides are not advancing.
Oh, they're not. Okay, well, thank you for mentioning that. Let me, oh, my apologies here. Let me try again then. I'm glad you mentioned that. I figured things were working well, but let me make another go here. 1 second, please. Okay.
The chart is on now.
Okay. So, and is advancing now? Or what do you?
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah,
great.
it's doing fine.
You're on slide 9. I don't know. Did you want to show us maybe?
Yeah, I can go back. My apologies. I figured everything was going well here. So, okay.
Yeah.
I want to dedicate this to Dr. John Clark and talked about the fact that why do we want to focus on one single state when we are an international affairs organization here? And I brought up kind of the national context that the most noteworthy climate action that's happened is the passage of this Infrastructure Act, which is going to lead to billions of dollars of new investment in our electricity grid and electric vehicles and mass transit and rail. Now, again, the coming attraction potentially is Build Back Better. We know that it does face a tough road, given that Senator Joe Manchin hasn't signed on, and he's that critical vote to get to 51 votes to pass this bill. And that's one reason why I think we need to focus on what's happening at the state level. The other thing is that the game-changing public policy, as I mentioned, is this carbon tax, which would apply to really all sectors of the economy and lead to figuring out the most cost-effective ways for industries to cut their carbon footprint and significantly accelerate us towards a zero carbon economy. And by the way, Ray, I'll count on you to raise your hand if these slides are not advancing. So the other thing that the skeptic might say is, well, why focus on Indiana? Well, you're right. We're only 0.085% of the world population, and we're only 0.427% of the global economy. So we look pretty small in the whole scheme of things. But the fact of the matter is that Indiana is very plugged into international markets. We have 800 employers from across the globe that have employed people in Indiana, and that employs at least 214,000 people across our state. And furthermore, Indiana plays an outsized role in the global economy. We are the top manufacturing state in America in the sense that no state is more reliant on manufacturing than Indiana as a percentage of our gross state product. We are a top 5 in agriculture, whether that's corn and beans or hogs or chickens. We are a top coal state. Now, of course, that's problematic from a carbon perspective, but we have historically ranked in the top 5 in terms of dependence on coal and on our production of coal. And we are the top in intersecting highways in the entire country. So that's kind of the case for why we want to spotlight Indiana. Now, the other reason, if we decarbonize and adapt in an innovative and rapid way, we'll be a model for an array of peer states. This is a map of states that over the last 4 presidential elections have voted either blue, of course, in the Democratic direction, or red in the Republican direction. And you see quite a number of states that could be influenced by Indiana, which is why I think there's a really strong case to be focusing on Indiana specifically when we're talking about climate solutions. Now, in particular, what I want to do, the angle that I want to bring to this broader topic of climate change and economics is to look at things from a very practical, real-time perspective, which is to tell you about bills that have been filed and bills that are in play in the Indiana State House right now. And as you may know, we're literally at the midpoint of the 2022 legislative session. So talking to you is very, very timely. Now, what I want to first talk about is climate solutions that cut greenhouse gas emissions. And as you can see from this chart, of course, there's a lot of different sectors that are contributing to greenhouse gas emissions. And we've seen this really encouraging decline in the carbon footprint of the power sector, but we're not quite seeing that same type of trend in many other sectors that are contributing to America's carbon footprint. Now, that makes the case for why we really need public policy to accelerate the downward trend in carbon emissions from these different sectors. Now, what I want to first focus on is rooftop solar. When we think about rooftop solar, we might say, well, this is the domain of the wealthy or maybe the upper middle class. Why do we even want to spotlight it as a climate solution? Well, the fact of the matter is that according to the National Renewable Energy Lab, we could get in America 40% of our electricity from rooftop solar. Imagine if every warehouse, every Amazon warehouse, every Walmart warehouse, every postal service distribution center, every university had their rooftop space covered with solar panels. Cumulatively, that could account for 40% of our electricity, which means a tremendous amount of savings of land compared to an approach that relies heavily on what's called utility scale renewable power. So part of the reason why rooftop solar is a climate solution is because, again, the sheer magnitude of which we can get our electricity from rooftop solar. The other thing is it's decentralized in nature. And in the context of climate change, this really matters. As you can see from this chart, we've seen an astonishing increase, an exponential increase in the amount of natural disasters that our country faces. And we've seen that, just a few months ago in New Orleans, leading to more than $1 billion in damage. And you see power lines getting knocked out, and that leading to people not having electricity for days, if not weeks on end. But if the power sector is decentralized, which is what rooftop solar would do, then if you knocked out some of the grid through a storm, an extreme storm, it wouldn't knock out all of the people because the power would be decentralized. This is what it looks like, as you can see here. And this is not a theoretical notion. We have seen this in New York City, where in the midst of Superstorm Sandy, all of Lower Manhattan had its power gone, except for one cluster around New York University, in which they were operating on what's called a microgrid. And that consisted of rooftop solar and what's called combined heat and power. And collectively, that led to continuity of power. And in the slide that I just skipped, there is this case to be made for decentralizing power, because one of the key predictions of climate change is we're going to see more and more intense weather events that are going to happen more frequently. In fact, we had $20 billion plus events in 2020 alone. It's a pretty astonishing reality that we exist in. And the other thing that is very virtuous about rooftop solar as a climate solution is that sometimes these businesses are located in underinvested parts of our country. In fact, in Indiana alone, I've noted here 4 companies that have located in areas that are either in rural Indiana, where the per capita income is lower than the average, or they're in urban areas of Indiana, in areas that have been historically disinvested. So what can you do, being a public policy organization as the Hoosier Environmental Council is? Well, first of all, please consider going solar, because state incentives are going to be gone within 4 months in Indiana. This policy called net metering, which I'm happy to talk about in the Q&A. And federal incentives peaked last year, and they're on the decline in 2022, and they will be gone in 2023 for residential customers. So there's a case to be made from that perspective to go solar, but there's also a case to be made to talk to your lawmaker about supporting the continuation of net metering and the continuation of something called monthly netting, which again, I'm happy to explain in the Q&A. But the bottom line is both of those public policies make the economics of rooftop solar projects much, much better. In fact, they reduce the payment periods of rooftop solar systems by 1/2 if we have this public policy in place. The second climate solution that I'd like to talk about is electric vehicles. Now, it turns out, perhaps to the surprise of many, that it is transportation, not the power sector, that is the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in the United States. And so we need to do everything we can. And while we've made great progress in decarbonizing the power sector, by virtue of the fact that we've retired half of the coal fleet over the last 15 years in Indiana, we haven't made similar progress in the transportation sector. Now, that is definitely going to change because a whole array of companies across the globe, the big auto manufacturers, are all getting into the electric vehicle business. And electric vehicles, no matter what type of electricity grid you are on, whether it's a coal-dominated sector or natural gas or renewables, is going to lead to greener transportation. And this chart by Statista really reflects that. India is a very coal-dominated country, and even there, if you shift over to EVs, electric vehicles, you're seeing nice reductions in carbon emissions. And then in a place like Europe, which leads the globe in terms of its green grid, you're seeing dramatic reductions in the transportation carbon footprint by the transition to electric vehicles. And even in Indiana, which again has historically been a coal-dominated state, as you can very clearly see in this chart, you are seeing this trend of a decarbonizing direction, where more and more of our electricity is being replaced from coal-powered electricity to natural gas and renewable-powered electricity. And that means greening the grid, and that means greening the sources of where we get our power to charge our electric vehicles. Now, one thing you can do in this realm is to support HB 1221, which authorizes pilot projects for electric utilities to be able to get into the world of electric vehicles. Basically, it means they're having the ability to build charging stations, to provide rebates to their customers to adopt electric vehicles or to buy chargers. And it also allows gas stations and retail shops to be able to carry out kilowatt per hour charging for electric vehicle charging, and that gets them into this business. So if 1221 were to pass, it's going to lead to a significant increase in electric vehicle infrastructure in our state. The third area, as far as climate solutions that I would like to talk about, is mass transit. And of course, Indianapolis is undergoing the most dramatic expansion in mass transit that we've seen in decades, based on the steady unveiling of bus rapid transit lines, starting with the red line and then heading over into the blue and purple lines. And once again, I want to remind the audience here that there's no sector that causes more carbon emissions in America than the transportation sector. And so mass transit is an important strategy. And if you look at this slide here, you see that there's a dramatic reduction in the carbon emissions that you get per passenger mile going from cars to mass transit, a significant reduction there. And furthermore, there's a pretty significant reduction in greenhouse gas emissions per mile, going from diesel-powered buses to going to electric vehicle buses. And so one call to action here is to simply support transit. Again, I know we're in the pandemic, and so you've got to put your health first. But if you're double masked and you've got your hand sanitizer, maybe ride the red line. Show your support through, as they say, voting with your feet. And also, please provide comments to Indigo in support of the blue line and the purple line. There was a bill that would have undermined the blue line And thankfully, as of now, that bill is dead in the legislature. But we always have to be worried about the Indiana General Assembly trying to undermine the prospects for mass transit because of these ideological biases that people have about the economics of mass transit. But the way that we can prove these lawmakers wrong is by people getting back into using mass transit again to the extent that they feel comfortable in the middle of this pandemic. Now, I want to talk about two other climate solutions here that we are pretty skeptical of at the Hoosier Environmental Council, but I did want to share them with you as these are bills that are moving through the General Assembly. One has to do with something called small modular nuclear reactors. So in this image, you see on the right a traditionally sized nuclear power reactor. And to its left, you see what's called an SMR, or small modular nuclear reactor. And obviously the land footprint of these is dramatically smaller, and they can be built in a way that a lot of components of it are prefabricated. They're built in a factory, and they literally are trucked to a site and installed. America has no SMRs as of today. And we're skeptical of this as a climate solution, because while you can make the argument that that nuclear power is got a dramatically lower carbon footprint compared to, say, coal or gas, the fact of the matter is it's an extremely expensive technology on a kilowatt hour basis or a megawatt hour basis. Case in point, in Georgia, they were proposing to build a nuclear power plant with an estimated cost of $14 billion. And now that plant is estimated to cost $30 billion, and that is not the end of it. So it's more than doubled in its costs. In South Carolina, they wanted to significantly expand a nuclear power facility there, and they ended up incurring $9 billion and then realized that the economics of this project weren't going to fly, and they abandoned the project. And they stuck the South Carolina ratepayers with a $9 billion bill for no extra power generation. The other thing is that in the one project that has advanced the most in the process, an SMR in Idaho, the initial cost of that SMR was $2.7 billion, and now it's mushroomed to $6.1 billion. We think on a kilowatt hour basis, there are just much smarter, cost-effective solutions. And like I said, our stance would be the United States adopt a carbon tax and let the best technology win, provided every other technology is properly permitted for different environmental imprints that they have on our society. And if it turned out that nuclear were to be the prevailing one, well, then bless them for them doing that. But we don't have a carbon tax, and now what we're doing is offering various tax credits and tax incentives and loan guarantees to various technologies in a very piecemeal manner. And we think this is not the best use of taxpayer dollars to go down this route, or to use ratepayer dollars to go down this route. And I'm happy to kind of elaborate here. So we're opposed to this bill, SB 271, that would really artificially incentivize our utilities to go in this direction of SMRs. The final public policy that I want to provide an overview for in this category of cutting greenhouse gas emissions is something called CCS, or carbon capture and storage. The Hoosier Environmental Council is not opposed to this technology in general, but we are evaluating on a case-by-case basis. So for those who aren't familiar with CCS, it was mentioned in the Great Decisions article. CCS is a technology in which you've got a factory or you've got a power plant, and it's emitting lots of greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere. What CCS technology does is it liquefies carbon dioxide, pressurizes it, and injects it deep into the ground, anywhere from 5,000 to 10,000 feet underneath us. And conceptually, it sounds like a good idea. There are certain sectors of the economy that are going to be hard to decarbonize. So we're not ruling out CCS, but again, it's proving to be a pretty expensive way to cut greenhouse gas emissions on, again, a kilowatt hour basis compared to other solutions. And I'm happy to talk more about that in the Q&A. So there are a couple of bills that have to do with CCS that are going through the General Assembly. kind of companion bills here, HB 1249 and SB 265, are essentially trying to provide liability protections to the first ever carbon capture and sequestration project that would be in the Terre Haute area of our state in the west central Indiana. And we think that's far too sweeping of a public policy, especially because we don't feel that the project developer behind this project has been really transparent about the whole array of risks that can happen, particularly because you're injecting CCS, you're injecting liquefied CO2 into the ground in an area that is a fault line in our country. One of the worst earthquakes to happen in the Midwest happened in Southwest Indiana. So we don't think this is a wise place to be doing CCS based on our understanding. And we haven't been able to get the kind of information from the project developer that we wanted to really be comfortable with this. Now, let me switch gears to talk about the other dimension of dealing with climate change. We've talked about an array of solutions to cut carbon emissions. Now I want to talk about solutions that would make our state more resilient to increasingly extreme and more frequent extreme weather. So one of them is wetlands. And for those of you who've been following the proceedings of General Assembly, you know that there was an awful bill that was adopted by the General Assembly last year that wiped out virtually, it wiped out a significant number of state level protections for our wetlands. And you might say, well, what does this have to do with climate change? Well, it turns out that wetlands are incredible sponges and they can absorb a lot of flood water. So if we are in the middle of a massive rainstorm, we can prevent downstream flooding to a farm or downstream flooding to a subdivision if we had a wetland upstream, acting as that sponge, absorbing tens of thousands of gallons of water. And furthermore, they are the most important habitat for our birds and for a notable percentage of endangered or threatened species in Indiana. And yet, we passed in last year a policy that wiped out protections for a large percentage of previously state protected wetlands. So why I bring this up in the context of the legislative session is that there was a bill that was proposed earlier this session that would have provided a tax credit to property owners to, if you save your wetland for a certain set of years, in exchange of that, you'd get a reduction in your property tax bill. Unfortunately, that bill was not allowed a hearing. But there are different methods by which we can try to safeguard our wetlands in our state. One is to work with our local land trust and make sure that a beautiful wetland area in the community that you're a part of gets permanently preserved. Another is to watchdog any kind of economic development project that might have an adverse impact on our wetlands. And we've got a staff member at HEC, Susan McGovern, who's our lead in doing this type of watchdogging to prevent undue damage to wetlands, or really to prevent any damage to wetlands, given that we have lost 80% of our wetlands in our state pre-European settlement. We also, if you're the kind of person that has a relationship with a lawmaker or wants to develop a relationship with your lawmaker, there's nothing more powerful desensitizing that lawmaker to the environment than by them experiencing the environment. So if you could take them to an area wetland, that could have a powerful impact on changing their attitude towards wetlands. Another particular public policy I'd like to talk to you about has to do with solar farms. Now, you might say, well, what does this have to do with climate resilience or adopting us to a increasingly extreme weather regime? Well, here you have a situation where you've got solar farms located on top of traditional turf grass. And compare that to this, solar farms that are on top of a meadow. And the distinction is quite profound. In the case here of turf grass, the grass is very shallow rooted. And if there's a storm, it's possible that that grass may come off, or at the very least, that the storm water will run off that field and possibly damage a farm field that is downstream from this solar farm. Now contrast it with this situation of a meadow in which you've got very, very deep-rooted grasses, native grasses, that's absorbing the floodwater, that is retaining the water and soil that is on that property, and therefore making a rural county much more resilient to the increased storms and increased flooding that we anticipate happening under climate change. And so the call to action here is to talk to your lawmaker and to ask them to support counties having the continued right to require environmentally friendly solar or pollinator-friendly solar. And if you are not located in Indianapolis and therefore are in one of the many counties that is undergoing consideration of a solar farm, talk to your local government officials, talk to your county commissioner, talk to your area plan commission director and say, I want to see pollinator-friendly solar in my community. I want to see environmentally friendly solar in my community. And that will shape their thinking about the type of solar farm that they want to host in their community. And if they adopt the wiser path of environmentally friendly solar or pollinator-friendly solar, it's going to lead to better management of stormwater. It's going to lead to more retention of soil and water. It's going to lead to the attraction of pollinators who have experienced a profound decline over the last 50 or 60 years in America. So those are the things you can do to create a more climate resilient solar field. I want to go over a couple more public policies before I wrap up here. What we're looking at here in this aerial photo is something called a coal ash waste pit. And no state in America has as many coal ash waste pits as Indiana. Even though we're the 14th largest state in America, no state has more coal ash waste pits than us. And it's because of this dominance of our reliance on coal for electricity. The problem is the vast majority of these coal ash waste pits are located next to rivers. Now think about the context of these waste pits located next to rivers and climate change. Climate change is going to lead to more flooding and more intense flooding. Now just imagine the danger of the situation where flooding could be so historic in nature that it ends up getting into these waste pits of coal ash and leading to this coal ash then getting dumped into our rivers and contaminating these rivers with arsenic and mercury and molybdenum and other toxic metals. This is not a theoretical possibility. We saw this happen on the Emory River in Tennessee in 2008, and it led to the largest environmental disaster in US history, the largest human-made natural environmental disaster in US history, 1 billion gallons of toxic coal ash flooding that one river. So, and this is what happened in 2008 in the Emory River. These homes were submerged, leading to billions of dollars in damage to this small community. And so what we would ask listeners to do is to let Governor Holcomb know that we should not have these coal ash waste pits in floodplains. They should not be allowed to be in our floodplains. A couple other policies I'd like to bring to your attention, which again, very much deal with this issue of climate change, this one in a very adverse way. HB 1100 called No More Stringent Ban. You see a person here in handcuffs. And the reason is because this public policy basically handcuffs our state experts, our state regulators, whether they're in IDEM or the Department of Natural Resources of the Indiana State Department of Health or any of the other agencies that report to the governor. None of them, excuse me, would be able to enact public policies more stringent than the federal government. And the practical repercussion of this from a climate perspective is, let's say Indiana wanted to deal more decisively with stormwater pollution, which is really the leading source of pollution of water pollution in Indiana. If we wanted to do something more aggressive than the federal government, we wouldn't be able to if HB 1100 were to pass. And that would mean that we would be handcuffing ourselves to try to address one of the most profound implications of climate change on Indiana, which is that we are going to again see a lot more frequent and a lot more intense flooding. And why should we unilaterally disarm our state from being able to address problems in as decisive of a way, which is exactly what HB 1100 would do. And that's why it's a bill that we oppose. On a positive note, we are delighted by the foresight of high school students leading the charge to try to get Indiana to adopt a climate task force in the form of SB 255. This effort has drawn bipartisan sponsors. Unfortunately, it was denied a hearing, as those of you who live in Indianapolis may have seen, because it got on the front page of the Indianapolis Star. The chairman of the Senate Environmental Committee decided not to hear this bill, even though this task force would have provided Indiana an opportunity to methodically understand how to address climate change, both in terms of cutting greenhouse gas emissions and making our community more adaptable to the extreme weather that we anticipate ahead. But citizens can keep talking about this issue because it does affect the consciousness of these lawmakers. And I'm happy to talk more about that in the Q&A. It absolutely does change their attitude about climate change. And I've seen it in the 14 years that I've been the head of the Hoosier Environmental Council. So to wrap up here, in addition to advocating for climate public policy, as I've described in great detail here, we hope that you make climate action part of your daily practice. Here's just an array of solutions that you can take on. A lot of people are trying to make an intentional effort to take the bus or bike instead of to drive. You could consider buying an electric vehicle. You could consider installing solar panels. You can consider adopting a more plant-based lifestyle where you have a meatless Monday, or if you've already adopted meatless Monday, you start to phase in more and more meat-free meals into your diet. And of course, making your home as energy efficient as possible. All these things have significant impacts on reducing your personal carbon footprints. I want to end by simply saying that we do have paths to make climate progress in Indiana, no matter how daunting it may seem. And for the sake of our fellow citizens and for all who live on Earth long after we're gone, we have no other moral choice than to act. We must act. So with that, I thank you for your attention and I look forward to the discussion.
All right, Jesse, thank you so much. So I'm Ray Montagno, and I'm going to be managing the Q&A for our session here. So I did send out a chat there so you can see my name. And if you would like, what you could do is, if you have a question, you send it directly to me. If you would like to ask your question personally, just indicate in the text and I will call on you and you can unmute yourself and talk. In the meantime, if you would stay muted, I would appreciate that. Since I have the stage here, though, I'll ask the first question. You were talking about the net metering and you said you wanted to talk about that a little more. A number of other states I've seen recently have also kind of adopted the same model that Indiana has, is to get rid of net metering. And one of the arguments the utilities make is that if more people move to rooftop solar, then the grid will suffer, because then we'll be have underinvestment in the grid, and folks who don't have rooftop solar will actually have to subsidize the maintenance and remodeling of the grid for folks who have rooftop solar. So what is your kind of position on that, or thoughts on that, Jesse?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the question, Ray. It's a great one. So first of all, for people who aren't familiar with net metering, the basic idea is that when you install solar panels on your home or your place of worship or your school or your university, part of the power that you produce from your electricity panels, your solar panels, are going to be used at home. And part of them are going to not be used at home because maybe you're working out of home. It doesn't sound like a very practical scenario in the middle of the pandemic, but let's say you are working outside of your home. Maybe you're a teacher or a nurse, and you're not using that solar power in the middle of the day. And so that power goes back on the grid. And the utility, under a net metering policy, credits you to the extent that that power is on the grid. Your meter literally dials backwards to the extent that that power is feeding the grid. And it shows up as a credit at the end of your month. Now, as Ray mentioned, Indiana and other states are in the middle of phasing out net metering, and they're making the arguments as Ray outlined. So the question is, are those arguments valid? And I would say the answer is no, for several reasons. First of all, net metering policies, to the extent that I'm aware of them, are ones that place a cap on the percentage of the total grid that can be attributed to net metering customers. So in Indiana, only 1.5% of total demand can be attributed to net metering. So it can never overwhelm the system because there is a cap that is in law. The other fact is that because of decisions that have been made by our Indiana Utility Regulatory Commission, which are more generally called PUCs or Public Utility Commissions, you have a situation where the commission has approved utilities to charge what's called a demand charge. And so no matter how little you rely on the grid, you have to pay that demand charge. And the logic of the demand charge is that if you have a very energy efficient home where your energy footprint per square foot is less than your neighbor, you're still going to have to pay a fixed fee month after month. And the logic of that is because it's your contribution to the grid. So those are the two big counter arguments to the utilities argument.
All right, thank you. Claire had a question. She said, would it be practical to mine minerals in coal ash pits to find some use to them before selling them off or burying them?
That's an excellent question. And, you know, it's interesting that West Virginia, it's a great question, Claire. West Virginia University is actually pioneering how we can extract precious metals from basically the legacy of coal. Their focus is on abandoned coal mines, but I'm aware of some entrepreneurs looking into mining from coal ash waste pits, and that would be a brilliant reuse of these coal ash waste pits. I mean, big picture wise, what's going to happen is some of the coal ash from these waste pits are pulled. And so what's happening is a lot of these coal ash waste pits are being dewatered. And so it's leaving this solid residue left. And there's some excavation of that solid waste to be used and repurposed in the making of concrete and other types of building products where coal ash is encased in, say, concrete and helps to build actually a more robust material. But there is some subset of the coal ash which cannot be reused. And that's the piece that we worry about. If it's left in a floodplain, because there's no lining of these waste pits, then it ends up leaching into a groundwater resource or potentially migrating its way into a river. So mining for it could be a smart way of preventing those heavy metals from hurting people or our natural environment.
All right, thank you. Betty has a question.
Thank you, Ray. Jesse, my question is goes a bit outside of Indiana, and it actually goes to Glasgow. When we were talking before the program, the state of Indiana is dealing with many of the same questions as are other states and as are other countries. And a lot of young people went to Glasgow, invited to this global summit, and for someone to actually sit at the table. And yet many of them felt as though they were just simply patted on the head and not really heard, told they were so inspiring, but industry leaders just proceeded then to carry on with their own plans with fossil fuels and so forth. What is the feeling, Jesse, of young people? Is there a sense of frustration? I wish we could simply we don't want to fall off the face of the earth, we older people, but we really have to step aside. My future is, I still have a future, but it's really short compared to somebody who's much younger. What is the sense you're getting from young people in terms of, besides the sense of fear and dread, of dealing with the frustration, feelings come out of Glasgow, and what the hopes might be?
Well, that's a fantastic question, Betty. And I think I can most meaningfully answer that in the context of Indiana, which is that young people have been at the forefront of agitating for climate action across the state. Uh, Young people have been responsible for several cities in Indiana adopting climate resolutions to call on the development of these communities to develop a climate action plan. They've been led by high school students with mentorship by organizations like Earth Charter Indiana. And they've succeeded in getting oftentimes bipartisan city councilors, as well as Republican mayors, as well as Democratic mayors, to take this issue seriously. So I think that's led to an infusion of confidence in them that they can make policy change. They're now trying to translate their successes at the local level, at the state level, which is they're the ones leading the effort to try to get this climate change task force. Of course, Hoosier Environmental Council is advocating as well, but really more as a support system rather than as the lead. And obviously they're feeling the frustration that groups like ours have felt, which is to see that their bill not be denied. But what's been beautiful is that they've not stepped away and said, we're giving up. They were denied a hearing on SB 255. And if you follow the process, technically speaking, the bill's dead. But they're trying to find a way to amend that language into other bills during the second half of the legislative session. And they are willing to call out these lawmakers in very aggressive ways, which is something that we Hoosier Environmental can't do because we are in a different place than them, because we have multiple issues that we work on. So a lawmaker could be horrible on one issue, but good on another. So we can't burn a bridge with one lawmaker on one issue because it may forego our ability to work with them on another. But they're in a different position. They are single-handedly focused on climate change, and they're willing to really call out these lawmakers in very assertive ways, but ways that I think are professional as well.
Okay.
So,
Oh, you
no, go ahead, please.
want to add something to that?
No, that's okay. I can elaborate at a later point, but I want to field as many questions as possible.
Sure. So here's a question from Jayant. Because solar and wind have so much variability that would have to be underlined by a consistent power source, would it be worth turning to nuclear for that?
Well, that's definitely an argument, Jen, that is made for nuclear power, that it is a baseload source of electricity. But I think that our perspective is that a state like Iowa is kind of showing a model for the rest of the country, where they're getting, believe it or not, Iowa's getting almost 60% of its electricity from renewable energy. 60, not 16, but 60. And the power is reliable in Iowa, and their cost per kilowatt hour that they're paying for electricity is lower than Indiana. So the reliability is there and the affordability is there. Why is that the case? Because grid operators have become so sophisticated to know that when they're anticipating a decline in the generation of output from a wind farm or from a solar farm, they know that they can ramp up their natural gas plants to compensate for that. I'm not saying it's going to be easy, but our position is that the existing natural gas plants, coupled with significant investment in utility scale renewables, will get us to a point where power will remain reliable. And during this period in which gas is still playing a very important role in power production, we'll reach a point where utility scale storage will be very economical, meaning massive battery arrays and other types of savvy technology, something called compressed air storage, for example, that's being piloted in Iowa. And that we will reach a point, say, in the next 15 to 20 years, where our electricity will come primarily from renewables plus storage with a little bit of gas and probably little to no nuclear and coal. That's kind of the paradigm that we would like to see. But again, utilities are making economic decisions on our own. It's, sometimes there's a little bit of an overestimation of the power of the environmentalist. I mean, the environmentalist, in my view, is the thought leader on these issues, and the trajectory follows what environmentalists have been advocating for. But the fact of the matter is, utilities are going to make decisions driven by what mix of electricity is affordable, reliable, and resilient.
Kind of a follow-up to that is, I know there's been some looking to France as being a successful user of nuclear power compared to its neighbor Germany that seems to be suffering now because they've closed their nuclear plants. What is kind of your reaction to that?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. And, yes, France and Finland are certainly examples in the world, countries that rely heavily on nuclear power. And France, from what I can tell, has done an excellent job managing it safely, although they have enormous amounts of radioactive waste and they don't have a central repository for that waste. So you've got massive pools of nuclear waste adjacent to these facilities. So that's a long-term problem that France has to contend with. And of course, France bears a special burden of domestic terrorism, as we've seen over the last several years. So that's a little bit of a worry for me. Germany, you're right, had some choppy waters as it transitions, but no country has really probably done as much to invest in kind of dealing with a increasingly intermittent resource and figuring out how to keep power reliable than Germany. I mean, I had the opportunity to be a part of a national study tour to Germany and spent a lot of time with civil servants and elected officials and entrepreneurs there. And it's just amazing how much they've invested in how to operate a grid with primarily intermittent resources. So I feel optimistic that German innovation will allow them to solve that problem.
Okay, thank you. There's a comment here from Barbara from Terre Haute, and she mentions the Earthlings group. And Terre Haute now has a city climate resolution, and they're on their way to a sustainability commission.
Bravo, brilliant.
Okay, so Claire had another question here. The microgrids are mentioned earlier would be less vulnerable to being hacked by foreign enemies. Is that a kind of a selling point to these microgrids?
That's my understanding. I haven't looked into, the cybersecurity advantages of microgrids versus other grids. So I guess the argument that could be made is it's just so much harder to, if you've diversified your grid in a way that you have hundreds of microgrids rather than a dozen macrogrids, then just logically speaking, you're sort of the cyber criminals can't get to everything, right? They can hack maybe a few macrogrids, but they can't get all the microgrids. So conceptually, that's what I would think would be the case. But I don't have any data to justify that.
What exactly is a microgrid?
Well, a microgrid is simply basically building a self-contained distribution system that is used by a neighborhood or used by several blocks within a city or a city. It's self-contained such that if everything else were cut off, if you were to somehow shut off any transmission lines into that city's power could continue on seamlessly.
Yeah, okay, thank you. We have a question here from Jayant. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing your name correctly, but if you'd like to go ahead and ask your question.
Yeah, you are pronouncing it correctly. I'm one of the students who worked on SB 255 with Confront the Climate Crisis. And my question is, what advice do you have for someone like me or anybody working on environmental legislation going forward?
Well, thank you for working on it. And I hope I did justice to the awesome work that Confront the Climate Crisis has done. In fact, we honored Confront the Climate Crisis with our one of our top awards at our annual conference a couple months ago. But I guess, Jonathan, my advice would be that you really invest in getting to know everything that you possibly can about a given lawmaker. I think that there is this immediate sense, there's a lot of despair that I observe when I talk to different audiences across the state. Obviously, I don't have that opportunity in the pandemic, but the different audiences I address, there's a lot of despair. And there's a sense that the supermajorities are so significant in the General Assembly that there's no possible way to make meaningful progress. And my general advice to them is get to understand your lawmaker with as much sophistication as you possibly can. Understand, again, using public information, no illegitimate means here, but understand everything about that person. You know, do they have grandkids? Does a grandkid have asthma? Do they have an uncle or a cousin who's an entrepreneur? Do they have a background in banking? Do they have a background in healthcare? Find everything that you possibly can and find a way to build a meaningful relationship with that lawmaker based on your best understanding about the lawmaker. And it turns out that that approach can bear fruit. They may be completely intransigent on one issue, but very supportive of another. I love to bring up the example of this extremely conservative lawmaker who I built a friendship with, and our politics and our worldviews could not be more different, but we reached common ground on renewable energy to such a degree that he ended up sponsoring our bill, and probably can't agree on 80% of the other things, but it was the fruit of significant investment in really building a relationship. So it can seem daunting based on the ideological differences between a given advocate and a given lawmaker, but if you get to know them really meaningfully, that bridge can be made.
All right, thank you. Just go back to Jane a second. To what extent do these local groups interact with international groups in terms of creating their agenda? I don't know if you want to answer that, or maybe Jane can answer that.
I could take a crack at it. So our group has not done anything internationally. A few of our members took a trip to DC to meet with our senators over the summer and try to talk to them. And some people in our group do work independently with international groups, but we haven't collaborated with any international groups. And we've collaborated with groups all over the state, like the Terre Haute Earthlings, but nothing international. And I don't think other local groups are collaborating internationally either.
Okay, thank you. So we had a question here about fireworks and toxic chemicals being released by fireworks. Is that an issue or is that a nuisance?
Well, it'd certainly be both. And I regrettably can't speak to the footprint of the fireworks. I mean, I think I'm happy that we're becoming more sensitized to the fact that, if you have PTSD, if you are, many types of animals are very sensitive to these explosions. So I think we as a society, I hope, can migrate to what's happening in different parts of Europe where they're doing away with fireworks. I understand the beauty and the symbolism and the power of tradition, but it seems like the psychological and pollution impacts of these don't justify their use.
All right. So here's kind of an interesting question. In Brazil, prisoners ride stationary bicycles that generate electricity. Is this something that can make a difference, or is this something you have in the United States?
Wow. I'm fascinated by the diversity of questions that I'm getting. Gosh, so the question is, can we adopt that practice in the United States? Well, I mean, I guess if it's in compliance with, both state law and, the appropriate law that's governing these prisons, whether it's state or local or federal, of course, it has to be compliance with those laws. I would also want to look to a ethicist who works with prisoners to make sure that they felt that this is a sound practice. But sure, I mean, if it was, we're always wanting to steward prisoners to help serve broader needs, whether that's helping to produce products for helping the needy, or providing some type of services to others. So, I mean, I guess conceptually, I wouldn't have a problem with it.
Utilities might complain that it's about net metering, though.
Exactly.
Yeah, sorry about that. I did hear one concern about solar panels in terms of their lifespan, 25 years, 30 years. We have millions upon millions of solar panels after their lifespan is ended. What happens to them in terms of a pollutant?
Yeah, no, it's a fantastic question, and it's one that we haven't thought through in America. Ideally, what there ought to be is there ought to be a federal law requiring recycling of solar panels. I know of one state that has that requirement, but yeah, I mean, it's could be an absolutely significant source of electronic waste in our country. Absolutely. And yeah, these solar panels last for 20 to 25 years. I haven't actually explicitly asked this question of the solar industry. I mean, I have a lot of relationships in the solar industry. If I were to speculate, I think their mindset is, of course, they know that in 20, 25 years, these solar panels are going to be depreciated enough that, they'll be pulled off. Or maybe they're presuming that it will last 30 or 35 years, but at some point it's going to reach the end of its lifespan. And I think that the working assumption of the industry is probably that they'll figure out a solution to recycling by that time. They've got the time to do it. But I do think it's very significant. I mean, you've got a whole array of metals that if they were to somehow degrade under the weather, could be problematic to groundwater resources and so forth. Obviously, I'm not talking about an imminent threat, but something that has been repeatedly battered by extreme weather over a 20 to 25 year period. At some point, it's going to degrade the material. So anyway, the long and short of it is that the industry needs to figure out how to do it if local governments and state governments don't have the political will to enact recycling requirements.
All right, thank you. We have a question from Gary here, and he's asking about the basics of climate change incorporated into elementary school curricula. Does the Hoosier Environmental Council work on that, or is that something how is that managed in the state?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know the answer to that. I mean, I think that what we've seen in the legislature in the Indiana General Assembly is that our legislature has no hesitance to stick its fingers in curricular design. I mean, we're seeing that this session where there is an effort to, ban critical race theory and other types of academic theories from schools. And the worry would be that because climate change has become politicized, that to the extent that schools are teaching that it too could be under threat under this legislature. From the limited experiences that I've had talking to school kids here, I know that they're learning about climate change in geophysical science classes, in chemistry classes. So, but I don't know if it's happening at that early of an age. Maybe Jayant or any other younger person can speak to that.
Yeah, that's a good point. Does anybody have a comment about that? Maybe a teacher might know something, could help us out here.
In second and third grade, we had some lessons on like recycling and the importance of it, and like fossil fuels being bad for the environment, but I can't really remember much.
Do you think that was a teacher choice, or was that part of the curriculum?
I think it was a teacher choice, but it was something that would be touched on by the curriculum, but our teacher emphasized it.
Okay, thank you. So in terms of kind of the international picture, to go back to that just a little bit, to what extent do you think wealthy countries like the United States should be supporting other countries that, third world countries, developing countries and their economies that maybe not have the resources that we have to kind of develop the technologies necessary to fight climate change?
That's a great question, Ray. I'd very much support that. I think that we have been, even though China is far greater of a carbon footprint than the United States has, we've historically been the overwhelming emitter, and therefore we're the principal reason for the damage that our global commons is facing, and yet the burden is falling on developing countries, as so many of us know. So I think the notion that President Biden has of contributing to an international fund that's used to provide R&D support to companies in the developing world to decarbonize, or that provides incentives to decarbonize, I think is good public policy.
All right. I have a question here from Susan. She got some information about loss of the bee population, and she's just wondering about whether these chemicals should be banned. What's been going on with respect to these toxic chemicals that are impacting agriculture today.
No, I mean, and by the way, Ray, I know that a couple of people have also raised hands. You may have noticed that, but I just wanted to flag that for you. But to answer that question, absolutely. We need to be much more aggressive in studying and regulating agrochemicals. It's devastated not only our bee population, but other pollinators, and such a large percentage of our fruit and vegetables in America and across the globe can only grow because of pollinators. And yet you've got all these different agrochemicals that are basically deadly to different birds, bees, beetles, and other types of animals that serve as pollinators. So that's kind of my general attitude. I know that the US EPA under the Biden administration is acting more aggressively compared to the Trump administration. I know that's a low bar, but even under the Biden administration, my perception is that the chemical industry has such clout that it may influence the pace and magnitude with which they're trying to deal with these agrochemicals.
All right, thank you. Jennifer, you want to go ahead?
Hi, thank you. Yeah, I really appreciate everybody's time tonight. And Jesse, thank you for sharing. I'm just an observer and listening, learning a lot. I'm a parent, a millennial parent with my daughter's in a Montessori school, and in that regard, I just wanted to speak to, it's an IPS Montessori school, and they are the Montessori curriculum in general promotes a vegetarian diet, and they do incorporate a lot of environmental education into their into every subject, which is really amazing. I've been really impressed with everything that she's been learning at her school. And I have worked in the solar industry previously, and we came across the issue of recycling the panels. And there is no place locally to dispose of them. And the tricky part is that I guess the combination of how the materials that they use and different makes and models of those panels is unique and not shared publicly. And so it makes it, and every panel has to be deconstructed and handled in its own way. And a lot of the panels are produced in China and India, which is good for their economy. But in terms of setting some sort of standard, it seems like that would have to be federal, but definitely important. I wonder what's going on there. I just started a position here in town with Kinetrex. We do produce liquefied natural gas, and they're also a very they're very aggressively expanding into the renewable natural gas field. And so I just wanted to bring up the renewable fuel standard program. I know that we don't have the carbon tax, but I was just wondering if you could compare those two scenarios and how do they compare? I mean, I just don't know.
And so Jennifer, thank you first of all for sharing your experiences in the solar industry. And you're right that so much of the complexity is around the diversity of sources and materials that are used to make these. As to the other item you raised, are you seeing kind of what are my thoughts of a renewable fuel standard vis-a-vis a carbon tax, or is there another question that you were asking?
Well, I am in seeing what's been proposed with the carbon tax. I really don't know that much about it, and I'm just now learning about the renewable fuel system and how they have to offset, how major polluters are required to offset their emissions by investing in renewable fuel sources. And it's like a credit-based system, and those limits are, I believe, reevaluated every year, and I don't think they come anywhere near the production of renewable fuels is not near what it needs to be. But I don't know how that how in terms of the transportation industry and what a carbon tax would mean in coordination with that.
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't have an answer for you in the sense of having looked at a study that evaluated the effectiveness of one option versus the other. I mean, conceptually, again, a carbon tax is much more appealing because it gives a lot of freedom for a company that is subject to the tax to figure out how to reduce their carbon emissions. So, if you're a oil refinery that's subject to the renewable fuel standard and they have to get a certain percentage of their fuel from ethanol or from eventually cellulosic ethanol, that's one way of implicitly decarbonizing. But the beauty of the carbon tax is it says to the refinery, look, you're not wedded to one option to cut your carbon footprint. You can do it by way of installing what's called CHP, combined heat and power, or it is through maybe having a hydrogen pilot project in tandem with your refinery, whereby the power that's needed to run the refinery comes from a hydrogen process rather than from a coal process. So I just love the freedom that a carbon tax provides. And I think conceptually it would end up in a lower cost of achieving carbon reductions than anything else.
Great, thank you.
Thanks for the question.
All right, Barbara, you're next.
Sure, thank you. Jesse, a wealth of information here, so thanks for your presentation. And I'm wondering, well, I'm a part of Citizens Climate Lobby, so when I hear carbon tax, I think carbon fee and dividend, which I think is the same way of saying the same concept, I guess I'd say. I'd like to know, especially because you started out with the carbon tax and how I agree, it's the biggest game changer. What's your advice about how to get some movement at the federal level to actually move us towards implementing carbon tax or carbon fee and dividend?
Yeah, thank you, Barbara, for the question, and thank you for your service to Citizens Climate Lobby. I really love the organization, and I love the fact that you have this principle of always going in and getting a Republican sponsor in tandem with the Democratic sponsor. That's such a astute model. But your question, I guess I would answer it in some ways the same way as I did Jayant's, which is that I never think we can, for many lawmakers, I don't think we can ever write them off. But it's figuring out, it's almost setting yourself up for a puzzle. And the puzzle is, how do you figure out how to move this particular lawmaker? And it's never going to be the same. And so, one of the things that was mentioned by Diane in her introduction of me is that I have this ethic of bridge building, and over the course of these 14 years, built relationships with the faith community, the public health community, the business community. That's because I have this unwavering conviction that we can build a big, broad, and expanding movement for sustainability because there are so many kindred spirits out there that we haven't activated. And so, for example, if the goal is to try to influence a Republican congressperson to embrace a carbon tax or fee and dividend in the CCL context, the idea is, okay, well, what do we know about this person? Is this person evangelical? Okay, well, who in his district or in her district do we know is a longtime prominent pastor who happens to be evangelical, and see if that person can be engaged. I know I'm not really saying anything profound, but I cannot emphasize enough how it is all about tailoring strategy around the elected official that you're trying to influence, getting to know every possible thing about them.
It's the long, slow slog of just, little bit, the hare and the tortoise, and just really making, it can be very de-energizing, to use an interesting term in this conversation, but yeah, I hear you. Thank you. I was hoping maybe you'd have some really amazing,
I'm sorry, I don't. It's just the attitude is to look at it. It's the marathon. I mean, we didn't get the Civil Rights Bill in 1964 and 1965 after 4 years. We got it after 80 years, right? I mean, the first Civil Rights Act having been passed in the 1870s. So, I mean, huge change. Abolition didn't happen in America in 5 years. It happened after decades and decades of agitation. So I know that doesn't sound comforting in the context of climate change, given how rapidly things are changing. But we've got these templates from the past of how big change happens.
Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara.
So is the carbon tax a state initiated approach, or is this a federal approach? How do we think about this?
Ray, we can think about it both ways. In British Columbia, for example, has enacted a provincial carbon tax. I believe Barbara, you probably know better than me. There's probably a couple of states in America that are seriously considering state carbon taxes.
I don't know.
Okay.
Not sure. It's hard to keep track of what's going on in Indiana in our little chapter. So
exactly. Well, but conceptually, Ray, yes. I mean, it could be administered by the State Department of Revenue of a given state, and you'd have to spell out which sectors are subject to the tax. What is the level by which they're, what is the tax rate? And does the tax rate go down, or does it go up over time, or does it stay flat? Tax design could certainly happen at the state level. There's nothing that prevents that.
All right. Well, I think we're out of questions here. Well, here, one just showed up from Gary. Okay. Are there any formal exchanges or technical best practices done internationally? How does this take place?
Oh, wow. Are you talking about with respect to advocacy, or with respect, with respect to what?
Well, I'm just guessing here, and unless Gary wants to come on and explain his question in a little more detail. Gary, you want to go ahead? Nope. Well, I guess one way I might think about it would be this carbon tax. Is this internationally, obviously, it may take different forms, and is there any collaboration across countries about how to create a carbon tax?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think that I think absolutely that happens. So, for example, there's an entity called the National Council on Environmental Legislators, and they meet. They are lawmakers, state representatives, and state senators from across the country. They meet together, obviously physically pre-pandemic, and then virtually during the pandemic, and all about creating best practices across states, and sometimes they'll invite international speakers. And I know that there's been a real intentional effort to learn from places like Germany or Japan, who have enacted dedicated aggressive carbon reduction policy instruments, and study how we might be able to adopt them in the American context.
Okay, Very good. All right, I think we are about out of questions here. It's about time for us to wrap up here. Betty, do you want to kind of take us home, please?
Thank you. Yes. Thank you for coming this evening. And thank you, Jesse. I think from the quality and the number of the questions, you were very well received. And it just underscores we very often, at least once a year, we have a program with the ICWA on climate, and we can't really say that about all of our topics because this is an urgent issue. And there's a number of ways to talk about it. And thank you for bringing it to home and attaching home to the world and how collectively we need to act together in this. Thank you very, very much. And I think those of you now, you see the name, if you want to get a hold of Jesse, I'm sure he'd love to hear from you. And I know he would really like to have your activism and your engagement. Next week, please come back and join us. Next Tuesday night, The Great Decisions is this is February the 8th, again at 7 o'clock. Remember, you got to sign up. We are talking about drug policy in Latin America. And we will have Dr. Michael Snodgrass. Dr. Snodgrass is with, I'm going to say the name fully once, Indiana University, Purdue University, Indianapolis. We call it IUPUI. And he is the Director of Global and International Studies at IUPUI and is also the Associate Professor of Latin American History. He's got a number of extensive awards, including a Fulbright. He probably went to Latin America with this Fulbright because I looked at his publications, and almost all of his publications, including his books, are focused on Latin America. And then please join us also the evening of February the 17th. That's going to be a Thursday evening. And on that particular week, I think that's 3 weeks from now, I believe. We will not have a Great Decisions because we have a distinguished speaker event, and that is on the US and Canada. So close and yet so different. And for that evening, we're going to have Dr. Pierre Atlas. And Dr. Atlas is well known to the Indiana Council of World Affairs programs. He was saying when we asked him to speak, he says, I think every year I've been giving at least a program for one program or the other for the last 16 years. He's that good. People like to listen to him. He is with also IUPUI, the Paul O'Neill School of Public and Environmental Affairs, also with the Center for the Study of Middle East at IU Bloomington. And some of you may know him because he writes a monthly column for the Indianapolis Business Journal and is a frequent contributor and opinion pieces in the Indianapolis Star. So thank you once again for joining us, and we will see you next Tuesday. And for those of you who are perhaps in central Indiana, please be safe. For those of us who've been saying, well, we're not getting any snow, the rest of the country is. Well, we're going to get walloped, maybe. Certainly sounds like it. We're supposed to get several inches. My grandchildren are looking forward to because they finally get to make a snowman. I don't know about the rest of you, but stay home, stay safe. See you next Tuesday.